Okay. So, I would like to welcome you all. This is the fourth talk in the Reason and Nature seminar, hosted by the Research Center for Greek Philosophy of the Academy of Athens. Our speaker today is Ray Brassier, professor of philosophy at the American University of Beirut, and he will present us uh, a paper whose title is Human Minds and Animal Minds. Uh, before we begin, I would like again to mention the difficult circumstances under which Ray joins us today. As many of you know, he lives in and works in Beirut, which is deeply affected by war and its consequences. And I guess whatever one's political commitments, I think that the scale of attack in Beirut and across the country and the region is, to say the least, deeply disproportionate and raises uh, is, questions about the legitimacy and the justification of such actions. And in light of all this, I would like to express my solidarity with Ray and hope it all goes well for him and the people living there in the region in the future. So, thanks again, Ray, for being with us today. And now the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Dionysus. Thanks first for inviting me for this colloquium, and thanks also for your expression of solidarity, which is very much appreciated. This talk is basically a version of my contribution to an edited volume called The Sellarsian Mind, edited by Jeremy Coons. So I think some of you may have read this contribution. I'm not an expert on the whole issue of animal minds, but I was invited to write about this topic, and it turned out to be extremely interesting. And I think I found that actually it kind of it reveals, it illuminates an aspect of Sellers's thought which I had hitherto kind of, failed to appreciate. So I found it very rewarding to write this, even though again it's not, I don't work on the topic of animal minds or animal consciousness per se. Okay, I'll try to get through this so as not to waste any more time. Okay. The question of animal minds concentrates a fundamental tension in Sellars' system. On the one hand, Sellars is a naturalist who insists that the human mind is a part of nature and that natural science is the measure both of what is and of what is not. Science both posits and eliminates. And this implies not just an essential continuity between human and animal minds, it also suggests that it falls to natural science to determine what minds are. And yet, on the other hand, Sellars' insistence that all thought is, as he puts it, fraught with ought, rule governed, and that all awareness, whether of universal or particular, is a linguistic affair, his commitment to psychological nominalism. This not only suggests a fundamental discontinuity between human and animal minds, it seems to imply that thinking as norm-governed activity lies beyond the purview of natural science because it unfolds within a logical space of reasons that is supposedly irreducible to the empirical realm of causes. How are we to make sense of this tension? Sellars' remarks on animal minds are scattered throughout his early and late writings. The most sustained discussion appears in the mental events paper late in Sellars' career, 1980. But the question of animality for Sellars has a metaphysical as well as an empirical aspect. And I think this is particularly evident in his discussion of Plato's cosmic animal in his uh, remarkable essay, The Soulless Craftsman, which I think was never actually, which appears in the Philosophical Perspectives collection, first published in 67, I think, but I don't think it was ever published elsewhere and if you read it, you can see why it wasn't published. It wasn't published in a journal. But anyway, in what follows, I propose to draw a line from the empirical to the metaphysical aspect. of Sellars' account. And I'll proceed in four stages. So first, I'll recapitulate in broad outline, the tenets of Sellars' psychological nominalism. Then I'll discuss Sellars' account of animal representational systems. Next, I'll set out Hans Johann Glock's Aristotelian challenge to what he calls lingualism, i.e. the language privileging, which he takes to be a facet of representationalism. And lastly, I will present Sellars' Platonic rejoinder to Glock's Aristotelianism. So in a way, I'm using Glock as a very kind of useful foil for Sellars' account, because in a way, he challenges what he calls representationalism and the undue privileging of language in philosophical accounts of mindedness. And that's why I think uh, you know Block is such a kind of a useful provides such an illuminating contrast to Sellars' account. Okay, but first I'll simply recapitulate the tenets of Sellars' psychological nominalism. So, um, oh, sorry, sorry, I've lost my paper. Okay, I need to. Okay, sorry. Ah, okay. No. Right. Can you see?
Uh, we can see your
Okay,
PowerPoint now.
you can see the PowerPoints. Okay.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, there's a problem because every time I do something, my paper disappears. Okay, I'll try to manage this anyway. I'm sorry. So first of all, psychological nominalism inverts the empiricist order of explanation, which usually runs from awareness to concepts to language. Okay, that's a standard kind of account. And Sellars' psychological nominalism inverts this so that the account runs from language to concepts to awareness. We do not have types of concepts because we notice types of things. We notice types of things because we have types of concepts. Or as Sellars puts it, all awareness of sorts, resemblances, facts, etc. In short, all awareness of abstract entities, indeed all awareness even of particulars, is a linguistic affair, end quote. Consequently, as he also puts it, instead of coming to have a concept of something because we have noticed that sort of thing, to have the ability to notice that sort of thing is already to have the concept of that sort of thing and cannot account for it, end quote. Now, note here that Sellars describes noticing as an active capacity rather than as a passive faculty, and it's a capacity enabled by concepts. Concepts allow us to do things. This is a key aspect of Sellars' pragmatism. Public language is at once the medium of conceptual activity and the resource through which we initially model the phenomenon of thinking as manifested in candid public speech. The concept of what Sellars calls thinkings out loud, in which thoughts are said to be in language-using animals like molecules or in gases, is the theoretical entry point for knowledge of minds, of our own minds as well as others. But theoretical vocabulary can acquire a non-inferential reporting role. And once I've learned to describe and explain the behavior of my fellow humans in terms of inner thought episodes, I can also learn to describe and explain my own states using the same vocabulary. Learning to do so is a public and social process, not a private, personal one. Our privileged access to our own mental states is a consequence of learning to use theoretical language in a reporting role. But reporting is a public act and not a private one. Thus, public evidence is built into the logic of mental concepts, even when these are used to describe private episodes. The criteria for using indexicals such as me, mine, I, etc., to designate mental states are public, even when the states they are used to designate are private. Thus, the use of theoretical concepts in a non-inferential reporting role indicates that knowing what I am thinking or feeling is not a so-called immediate experience, or what philosophers have often characterized as immediate experiences. Is this to say that there are no immediate experiences? This is often taken to be the kind of, the consequence of Sellars' view. But I don't think it is. It is Sellars is marking the difference between having an experience and knowing it, or between experiencing and experienced. Let's see if I can move on the PowerPoint. Um, no, I'm sorry. Sorry, I have to show. I can't. I can't see my own paper. Um, okay, so I'll just have to go back and forth between the paper and the PowerPoint. So I'll continue. Sorry. So Sellars is marking the distinction between experiencing and experienced, or as he puts it, the fact that something looks red to me can itself be experienced, but it is not, therefore, an experiencing. Uh, what is experience is propositionally formed, but its experiencing is not. On this account, then, experiencing is a processual unity comprising sensing as well as thinking. What is experience can be decomposed into a propositional and a descriptive component corresponding to thinking and sensing, respectively. And the conclusion to be drawn here is that while facts can be experienced, their experiencing is not itself factual in form unless it is turned into the object of another experience. And this will be important for what follows. There are three features of sensation that need to be stressed here, okay? Let me see if I can share now. Hmm. Okay. First, sensation. Uh, no, I'm sorry. I can't. I can't see what I'm supposed to be reading.
All right.
Um,
If it helps, it to us as viewers, it doesn't matter how large the image is. So the PowerPoint could be very small, but for us on the screen, it's still filling the entire screen.
okay, let me try this. Let's see this. Okay. Can you see now the PowerPoint?
Yep, that's fine.
Okay, great.
Yes,
So
okay.
now if I do this,
Yep, can see it loud and clear.
okay, great. Thank you. Okay.
No problem. Yeah.
Okay. So three further features of sensations can be stressed here. First, that my sensation of a red triangle exists doesn't entail the existence of a red and triangular sense datum. distinct from the red and triangular physical object that I sense. Or as Sellars puts it, how could a sensation be actually red and triangular without being a specific shade of red or a specific triangle? It is precisely to avoid this quandary that philosophers have assimilated the oddness of sensation to the oddness of thought, attributing an intentional inexistence to sensibles that parallels the intentional inexistence of intelligibles, where intentional inexistence is understood as presence to consciousness, but absence from physical reality. But they must be kept separate, according to Sellars. Our sensory awareness of something is not assimilable to the thought in which we are aware of it as the thing that it is. Second, sensations are not particulars. Only spatio-temporally individuated objects qualify as particulars. Sensations are states of perceivers modeled upon physical particulars. And as with thoughts, the model features a commentary which, while establishing an analogy between its properties and those of the original, also qualifies, restricts, and interprets the analogy between original and model. And finally, third and finally, sensations are not physiological states. They are introduced as entities that differ in kind from physical entities. Physiological states can be identified with physical states, and organisms have physical properties, but they are not physical entities in the sense in which inorganic objects are, according to Sellars, because some of their properties, including their sensory states, are not physical. Sensations then belong to a molar framework that cannot be reduced to the molecular framework of microphysical particles. These frameworks correspond to the manifest and scientific images, respectively. Thus, it is a category error to try to identify sensations with microphysical objects or events. So, while thoughts are propositionally formed, sensations are adverbially construed as occurrent happenings, and both are to be distinguished from physical objects and events. But they are not thereby identified as immaterial objects. Their specific ontological status is left undetermined, but prospectively determinable through some future enlargement of our scientific understanding of the physical to include the capacities of living beings. And moreover, while maintaining that what we experience is endowed with propositional and thereby linguistic form, psychological nominalism does not assimilate all experienced content to propositional content. Sensations are not concepts, nor does it assimilate our experiencing of facts to experienced facts. The capacities for thinking and sensing, jointly exercised in experiencing, determine what is experienced without the latter mirroring the former. Or, to put it in terms used by Sellars himself, while experiencing unfolds in the real order, what is experienced occurs in the conceptual order. And while the latter has propositional form, the former does not. And this then is why the capacity for awareness presupposes unconscious mechanisms whereby organisms can take what their environment gives without being aware of it. So while sensory awareness of contributes to conceptual awareness, or awareness as, distinguishing experiencing from what is experienced invites us to explain how organisms are able to discriminate and select the features of their environment of which they will become aware. And this is the role of representation. Representation, says Sellars, is the manifestation of dispositions and propensities whereby organisms both map their environments and locate themselves within these maps. And thus, while mental representation is the condition for both sensory and conceptual awareness, it is neither sensory nor conceptual. Okay, so now we move to animal representational systems. The core concept of a mental event, says Sellars, is that of a representational event. And if language is primary with regard to our knowledge of the mental, representation is primary with regard to its being. A representational event designates and characterizes features of an organism's environment or features of the organism in its environment. And importantly, designation and characterization do not require a resemblance relation between representing and represented. And the whole impetus of Sellars' account is to develop an account of representation as correlation without resemblance. The correlation is between distinct and heterogeneous systems of resemblances and differences, rather than between similar or dissimilar objects. But while individual token inscription is the simplest way of designating, Sellars is concerned to show that characterization need not require token inscription. Object characteristics or relations can be indicated by modes of inscription. For example, by, if we consider illustrations, typographical devices such as boldface and italicization, or the spatial configuration of symbols. Thus, for example, red X can be represented as, boldface X, or X is larger than Y can be represented as X above Y, or X is a predator can be represented as X underlined. Once a system of referring and characterizing inscriptions is in place, their syntactical configuration can represent compound states of affairs involving properties, relations, or kinds of objects without separate symbols for these properties, relations, or kinds. And on this basis, a representational system can execute rudimentary inferences from one representation to another, such as, for instance, if X is bigger than Y, then X is a predator. This is a Humean or non-logical inference governed by a rule of association rather than deduction. But such associative inferences can serve to trigger responses to perceptual states such as, if X is bigger than Y, then X is a predator, then flee. The representational states of a system capable of such rudimentary Humean inferences are already endowed with propositional form insofar as they refer to and characterize objects. And in this regard, Sellars insists propositional form is more basic than logical form. The latter is a relation among representations that involves deriving one from another on the basis of what Sellars calls a standing representation, containing logical operators such as a conditional, negation, conjunction, or disjunction. But for Sellars, the conditional is perhaps the most important. Where a Humean system moves from X is larger than Y to X is a predator associatively, an Aristotelian system moves from the standing representation if X is bigger than Y, then X is a predator, to X is bigger than Y, to therefore X is a predator. Aristotelian systems deduce representations from one another on the basis of standing compound representations involving conditionals, negation, conjunction, and disjunction. And these codify relations amongst representations which are not contained in the representations themselves. Humean systems, by way of contrast, mine conditionals, conjunction, and disjunction through propensities, association, and rejection. And thus, for Sellars, rejection is more basic than negation. He gives the following example. Suppose a Humean system with the propensity clusters A. If it represents triangle there, it rejects circle there and square there. If it represents circle there, it rejects square there and triangle there. C. If it represents square there, it rejects triangle there and circle there. The first of these propensities would be actualized by the concurrence of the following state. E. It represents triangle there, it rejects circle there, and it rejects square there. And similarly, mutatis mutandis for in other cases. However, for an Aristotelian system equipped with the operator for negation, representing P entails rejecting not P and vice versa. Our representation of human systems encourages us to assume that rejecting P is equivalent to not representing P. But not representing P is not the same as representing not P, where the not in the former means rejecting the representation of P, the not in the latter means representing the rejection of P. It is the integration of conditionals, conjunctions, disjunctions, and negations into representations themselves that distinguishes the Aristotelian use of logical vocabulary from its mention in our descriptions of human systems. Now, there are two important points to retain here. First, propositional form does not require predication. And the realization that characterization does not require auxiliary symbols releases us from the assumption that representations of facts like X is F, X is a K, or X is related to Y necessarily involve abstract entities such as properties, kinds, or relations. And second, propositional form is representationally more basic than logical form. The key distinction then is not between pre-linguistic and linguistic representation, but rather between Humean and Aristotelian representational systems. And this is the difference between systems connecting and disconnecting representations on the basis of propensities and systems capable of representing relations between representations. In the first case, the transition from perception to action is mediated by single material inferences, material in the sense that they depend on the specific meaning or content of the representations involved, while in the second, it is mediated by general deductive inferences, connecting specific representations by representing their generic connection. Now, perhaps most importantly, functional equivalences can be established across Humean and Aristotelian systems through Sellars' dot quoting device. Dot quoting establishes a functional equivalence between familiar and unfamiliar language tokens. For example, between Alsulathea and the English triangular, such that Alsulathea is a dot quote triangular. The dot-quoted expression on the right forms a metalinguistic sortal which classifies it by affirming that the quoted expression on the left performs the same functional role as it. Dot-quoting classifies by exhibiting the functional role of a familiar expression and correlating it with an unfamiliar one. But if linguistic expressions can be dot-quoted, so can representational states with propositional form. Thus, X is bigger than Y is a dot quote X is larger than Y. Dot quoting forms meta-representational sortals which classify types of representing rather than types of represented. It can be used to establish functional equivalences across Humean and Aristotelian representational systems, as well as between systems of the same kind. Thus, Sellars anchors mentality in representational capacity, where the use of logic amplifies this capacity and thereby the capacities for perception and action. Logic does something. It enables language-using animals to represent ramifying alternations of perception and action, extending beyond action's immediately localized binding to perception. So what then is Sellars' basic position on the relation between human and animal minds? Mindedness exists on a continuum of representational capacity ranging from simple to complex propensities, culminating in the qualitative divide between Humean and Aristotelian systems, but extending even beyond the latter. Yet analogies and equivalences can be established across this divide. Thus, Sellars has no hesitation in claiming that animals can think and perceive qualitative states of affairs. Or, quote, as he puts it, of course, there is a legitimate sense in which animals can be said to think and hence to be able to see a pink ice cube and to see that it is pink, end quote. And moreover, even if the core concept of thinking is that of conceptual thought, this core furnishes a model which can be extended analogically to encompass non- or proto-conceptual representation. And nor is it correct to maintain that thinking requires language understood as natural language, since the propositional form involved in elementary representations does not involve semantic properties like truth, reference, or predication. Thus, as Sellars puts it in a lengthy passage from The Structure of Knowledge, if one ties thinking too closely to language, the acquisition of linguistic skills by children becomes puzzling in ways which generates talk about innate grammatical theories. Not all organized behavior is built on linguistic structures. The most that can be claimed is that what might be called conceptual thinking is essentially tied to language, and that for obvious reasons, the central or core concept of what thinking is pertains to conceptual thinking. Thus, our common sense understanding of what subconceptual thinking is, i.e. that of babies and animals, involves viewing them as engaged in rudimentary forms of conceptual thinking. We interpret their behavior using conceptual thinking as a model, but qualify this model in ad hoc and unsystematic ways, which really amount to the introduction of a new notion, which is nevertheless labeled thinking. Such analogical extensions of concepts, when supported by experience, are by no means illegitimate. Indeed, it is essential to science. It is only when the negative analogies are overlooked that the danger of serious confusion and misunderstanding arises. End quote. So, the analogical extension of the concept of thinking upstream as well as downstream of Aristotelian systems allows us to revise and refine it so that it might be applied beyond its narrowly folk psychological ambit. Yet, given Sellars' tying of representation to capacity, it is instructive to compare his account to one that opposes representation to capacity. And a powerful version of this opposition has been developed by Hans Johann Glock. Okay, so we move now to Glock's capacities against representation. Glock aligns representationalism with what he calls lingualism, which is the claim that thought requires language. But he rejects both. Thinking, he insists, is not a relation or attitude of minds to contents, whether conceptual or non-conceptual. It is a modification of subjects involving abilities. The chief capacity of minded animals is the capacity for knowing that, understood as a direct perception of facts. Now, the first thing to note is that Glock rejects Sellars' knowledge-first approach to the metaphysics of mind. Only by first understanding what minds are, says Glock, can we subsequently come to know whether or not something is minded. His approach, Glock's approach, ties the metaphysics of capacities to a metaphysics of facts. We'll unpack the consequences of this tie once we've laid out his argument. Mental vocabulary, according to Glock, registers differences in the behavioral and perceptual capacities that human beings are interested in. Minded beings are endowed with an array of cognitive, volitional, and affective powers, or capacities for knowing, wanting, and sensing, that are irreducible to A, their exercise in behavior, the opportunity conditions determining their exercise, C, their enabling conditions, D, the subject possessing them, E, or the vehicle of the ability, i.e. the physical ingredient or structure causally enabling this ability. Nothing is gained, insists Glock, by trying to explain these powers in terms of representation. On the prevalent account, exemplified by Jerry Fodor's representationalist theory of mind, thoughts are representations because they possess semantic properties. Thus, thoughts express propositions that are either true or false. They can successfully refer or fail to refer to an object X. They deploy concepts that either apply or don't apply to the designated object. But representations in this minimalist sense, Glock insists, cannot explain thought. For to represent states of affairs or singular objects or properties or kinds of things is to think. It's to think that P about X, about F's, or about things being F. And thus representationalism is reduced to uninformative claims like to think that A is F is to represent A as being F. To think of F's qua F's is to represent F's. By way of contrast, Glock suggests the capacity approach offers a conceptual explanation of what thinking is. And what it is, says Glock, is as follows. To think that P or about F's as F's is spelled out in terms of the possession of certain cognitive and phonative abilities, end quote. Now, what Bloch calls lingualism is a species of representationalism. And what he calls the lingualist master argument runs as follows. First, the concept thesis. Thinking or having thoughts requires concept possession. Then the language thesis. Concept possession requires language. And the conclusion, therefore, thinking or having thought requires language. By combining the concept thesis and the language thesis, lingualism concludes that animals cannot think. And lingualism is allied to propositional reductionism about mental states, which claims that all statements of the form, one, A intends to climb a tree, or A admires Angela Merkel, or A sees the Matterhorn, or A craves M&Ms, can be analyzed into statements of the form A V's that P, where the verb V expresses an intentional attitude towards a proposition P. But this, says Glock, is to confuse the contents of mental states with their rationalizations, which paraphrase them in terms of reasons. However, that the rationalization of intentional states involves that clauses, stating propositions, does not entail that those states themselves involve relations to propositions. Propositional rationalization drives a wedge between the intelligence evident in animal behavior and the contents of their mental states. And the act-content distinction between believing and believed encourages the view that while intentional verbs like knowing, hoping, fearing, or wanting can be used analogically in characterizing animal behavior, propositional contents cannot be attributed to their mental states. Humans think, but animals can only be endowed with proto-thoughts. And this is a grave problem with lingualism, according to Glock. Now, here it's important to mark the difference between using language to establish analogies between acts of believing, wanting, or fearing, and using it to establish analogies between their supposed contents. While we characterize what is experienced in terms of propositional contents, these are not to be construed as separable objects. And what Sellars calls thinkings out loud make meaning manifest as a concrete act. They don't intend meanings as abstract objects. So while thinking for Sellars has a focal sense as thinking out loud, its analogical extension across species establishes equivalences of function rather than identities of content. Glock rejects this equivocation, and this is why I think he is compelled to replace representationalism's act-content relation with an act-fact relation. Thus, on his account, ascribing beliefs to a subject does not place it in a relation to a proposition, but situates it in the context of a system of describing and explaining behavioral capacities. And these capacities form an articulated whole oriented towards objective facts, not propositions. Consequently, minded beings can believe that P without believing the proposition that P. While believing that P is simply a matter of believing something to be so, believing the proposition that P is a matter of believing something to be true. And as Glock puts it, quote, in the case of simply believing, the focus is on how things are or might be. Whereas in the case of believing a proposition, the focus is on how they have or might be stated or believed to be. End quote. Knowledge itself, says Glock, can be defined as, quote, the capacity to be guided by facts such that creatures can possess that ability without being capable of stating those facts or conceiving of them as facts. Moreover, if perceiving is used as a factive verb, as it is commonly in both the human and the animal case, and if animals can perceive that P, then they are capable of knowing that P. And thus, knowing is perceiving. This invites what Glock calls a holodoxastic conception of mind, which treats intentional states as simple wholes rather than complex compounds. What is believed is defined with regard to a subject's believing or doxastic state. Quote, if a creature can be correct or mistaken as to how things are, Glock insists, it can have beliefs. That the sentences we use to ascribe beliefs have components does not entail that those beliefs have the same components. Belief ascriptions, says Glock, are based on the subject manifesting certain perceptual capacities, attitudes, and emotions. And in the non-linguistic case, he insists these manifestations include forms of behavior, postures, and facial expressions that higher animals share with human beings. End quote. So, Locke's holodoxatic account is a form of holism which insists that humans and non-human animals share a generic form of life, animality, within which specific differences can be identified. The underlying commonality, mindedness as coordination of capacities, transcends differences in behavior, opportunity, enabling conditions, species of subject, or causal vehicles through which these capacities are exercised. The basic unit of analysis for understanding mindedness is the unity of the world. And since mind is a capacity and capacities are world-oriented, shared understanding of a common world, despite differences in capacity, is the starting point for understanding mind. This holism combines a significant methodological premise with a substantive metaphysical commitment. The methodological premise is that apart from language, factors such as behavior, posture, and facial expression are indices of intentionality insofar as they plausibly resemble their human counterparts. But unlike Sellars, Glock does not ground the correspondence between human and animal indices of mind in functional analogies between representations belonging to different systems. Instead, Glock assumes a first-order analogy between the same indices, i.e., behaviors, postures, expressions, in different animals, rather than a second-order analogy between the functions exercised by different indices in different animals. And thus, for example, identifying indices of intelligence in cephalopods or invertebrates should not assume resemblance at the level of familiar indices such as behavior, posture, or expression. Where abstracting function from its recognizable indices allows us to construct functional analogies across species, identifying function on the basis of its recognizable indices confines it within the limits of organic resemblance. The metaphysical commitment concomitant with this methodological premise is the claim that the world consists of facts, not things. And this follows from Glock's insistence that animal perception or knowledge is fact rather than object-oriented. And his argument for this is as follows. Quote, so he writes, Consider a dog that has learned not to grab anything when it is lying on the table, but only when it is lying in his bowl. This dog now sees a bone on the table, but refrains from grabbing it and instead looks on panting. Yet as soon as the bone is placed in the bowl, the dog goes for it. This mundane sequence of events is not explained by the dog simply perceiving discrete objects, the bone, the table, and the bowl. It can only be explained in terms of the following opposition. First, the dog sees at time t1 that the bone is on the table. Then the dog sees at time t2 that the bone is in the bowl. Why? Because at both t1 and t2, the dog can see the bone, table, and bowl. So perception of the conglomeration formed by these three objects cannot explain the dog's different behavior at t1 and t2. One might respond that the problem vanishes if spatial relations like x being on y are among the objects that the dog can perceive. However, simply perceiving three distinct objects, bone, table, x being on y, does not explain the dog's behavior. Such an explanation is only in the offing if the dog can also perceive that the bone stands in the relation of being on to the table at one moment, to the floor at the next. And in that case, we are back with perceiving that P. Here then, it is the dog's ability to perceive the difference between the fact that the bone is on the table and the fact that the bone is in the bowl that explains why the dog refrains from grabbing the bone on the table, but grabs it when it's in the bowl. But if the world consists of facts, it consists of structure, since facts are both internally structured and integrated within larger structured facts. And the world as totality of facts has both a fine and a coarse-grained structure. To ascribe the ability to perceive facts to animals is to ascribe to them capacities for perceiving facts at different scales of complexity. And this is already to make a very substantial assumption about the structure of reality. And thus, I think the cost of holodoxastic minimalism about the composition of belief is a metaphysical maximalism about the factual composition of reality. Are both large and small-scale facts perceptible in principle? Locke provides an answer of sorts by explaining that whereas animal perception and behavior involves the organism as a whole relating to a unified environment, the activities of plants and microorganisms are driven by the responses of their cellular parts to elementary information, such as light, temperature, sound, or scent, information that does not represent the environment as a whole. This is not a totalizing holism then, but a holism of organic life worlds. Unlike plants and microorganisms, animals unify their environment and are unified by it in return. However, this premium on wholeness, stressing the reciprocity between the unity of perception and the unity of fact, effectively transplants propositional structure from thought to the world. And in doing so, it deprives us of the explanatory resources through which we might account for differences in perceptual scale within the animal domain. And since such differences are themselves facts about the world, because animals are part of the world they know, the facts that explain them cannot just be facts about capacities. If the difference between the facts perceived by dogs and those perceived by cockroaches is a consequence of the difference between their perceptual capacities, and perception is oriented towards fact, then it is precisely scalar differences in factual structure that explain differences in perceptual capacity. But such scalar differences extend beyond familiar perceptual scales to encompass molecular phenomena whose description requires the conceptual resources of biology or physics. And it is facts at this level of description that explain the genesis of capacity. Moreover, it is precisely the concept of representation as a selective mechanism commensurating capacities and affordances that is supposed to mediate between organisms and environments at different scales. It does so by explaining the function of perception. By ditching representational function, Bloch's doxastic holism puts upon the world such pressure to unify that it cracks apart, fracturing into separate spheres of fact, such as the facts perceived by dogs and the facts perceived by cockroaches. Okay, Dionysus, I'm almost, how much more time can I realistically have? It's 10 to 6.
There is no problem. We can extend the talk however much you like. No problem.
Well, 10
10
minutes then.
minutes,
Okay,
10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes. Okay.
okay, 10, that's fine. I'll try to wrap this up, okay?
Okay.
Sellars rejects Bloch's methodological premise. Indices of function cannot be rooted in resemblance. And he also rejects its metaphysical corollary. Knowledge is the facts, but the world consists of things. For Sellars, the world consists of things, not facts. The problem of representation, or of the relation of representing to represented, is to explain how things come to be represented through facts. And this is a Kantian problem, which Bloch appears to reject in favor of an Aristotelian framework in which epistemology is incorporated into metaphysics. Knowledge itself is a power or capacity. Sellars does not reject Aristotelian holism, but he restricts its scope to the manifest image. Ultimately, he writes, the common sense picture, or the manifest image of the world, in spite of its delicate coherence, poses problems which it lacks the resources to resolve. Thus, Sellars accords the scientific image the peculiar privilege of describing and explaining why the world appears to us as it does. And in explaining the genesis of appearance, science also explains the genesis of organic unity. And this means that while Aristotelian holism is right to insist on the autonomy of organic form, and the capacity is concomitant with that form, this autonomy and these capacities are generated through the historical cumulation of disposition. And thus Sellars writes in his paper Aristotelian Philosophies of Mind, he writes, the concept of the nature of a thing, which is to say its essence or substantial form, insofar as it is a coherent one, can be analyzed in terms of the concept of dovetailing set of dispositional properties, which specify both the states by which it has responded to its historical circumstances and the states by which it would have responded to other circumstances. The actual history of the universe must be recognized to be an ultimate fact. There may be other aspects of reality on which process depends, in the sense that without them it would be impossible, but process cannot derive from that which is not process. And I take Sellars' point B to here that the ultimate fact, which is the actual history of the universe, its empirical science provides us with the conceptual resources through which we can limit the complex structure of this ultimate fact. It's not metaphysically ascertainable. Thus, the unity of substantial form is the functional unity of dispositional properties. It is not form that generates becoming, but becoming that generates form. And if process is ultimate, as Sellars insists, then even the fundamental categories through which we make sense of our world are historical products. And historical in a biological and sociological sense, which does not disqualify their transcendental status, which is to say, their conceptual indispensability. It is the fact that universals exist within practical frameworks which connects their existence to the world of becoming. But it is this practical link that Aristotelianism unwittingly disregards through its resort to what Sellars calls intuitive induction. Intuitive induction is empirical knowledge of essences via the inference from this K is F to being K entails being F. In other words, one moves from perceptual knowledge of particular objects to intuitive knowledge of the universals instantiated by those objects. Or Sellars puts it, one comes to see that there's a connection between the abstract entities being a K and being F. Aristotle, however, by the specific character of his treatment of the primacy of individuals and the knowledge of individuals, has committed himself to think of the knowledge of the requiredness pertaining to universals as not merely occasioned by the intuitive knowledge that this K is F, but as derivative from the knowledge of a requiredness which obtains at a level below that of universals, this K requiring this F. Thus, the perceptual link between this kind of thing and this property grounds the necessary link between being a K and being F. The former are concrete particular, Aristotle's this is, the latter abstract universals, kinds and properties. Intuitive induction claims that the latter are perceptible in the former. But the appeal to intuitive induction also seems to be at work in Glock's claim that animals can perceive facts. For if a dog can perceive the difference between the fact of the bones being on the table and the fact of the bones being in the bowl, then it perceives a difference in the properties of kinds, since presumably it sees tables and bowls with and without bones. And if so, it sees being a bone, being a table, and being a bowl, which are kinds, not objects, together with the difference between bone and a table, bone and bowl. The question then is whether the dog infers don't grab directly from bone on table and grab, the question then is whether the dog infers don't grab directly from from bone on table and grab directly from bone in bowl, or whether it recognizes the biconditionals if bone on table don't grab, if bone in bowl grab. Now, this point may be moot, but once representation is ruled out, as it is by Glock, either the dog perceives ties between properties and kinds, or its behavior remains a Pavlovian reflex tied to particular objects. Ultimately, then, on Sellars' reading of Aristotle, the perceptual tie between kind and property is grounded in their metaphysical tie, which generates the movement of substances towards their ends. This movement, in turn, is generated by the noetic activity of the prime mover, God. Animal activity is guided towards ends whose realization is facilitated by intuitive induction. The intuition of kind properties is a capacity enabling purposive activity. And it is here that Sellars' contrast between Plato and Aristotle comes into play. For Aristotle, the purposiveness of artisanship rests, says Sellars, on a level which is analogous to artisanship, end quote. I've substituted artisanship where Sellars writes craftsmanship. Substantiality is modeled upon artifactuality. The purposiveness of organic substance is like that of artifacts for Aristotle. But Plato, or Sellars' Plato, is more radical. Purposive activity is artisanship, i.e. demiurge. So as Sellars puts it, Plato's ideas are the final causes of existence only by virtue of inspiring souls to shape the flux of becoming in their image. For Plato, all realizing of ends is no mere analogue of, but simply is artisanship. Thus, for Plato, substantiality is artifactuality because the demiurge who fashions the world into a cosmic animal creates an incorporeal order for the rightful governance of living bodies, understood as the spatial-temporal parts of a single gigantic organism. For Sellars, however, this demiurgic activity is precisely the province of rational animals. since the actual history of the universe is an ultimate fact, and since this history includes the evolution of rational animals, it falls to these animals to craft the incorporeal order of categories for the rightful governance of bodies. Intelligibles are made, not given. The intelligible realm is a system of means and ends through which minded beings fashion this cosmic animal, which strives towards the good. Thus, for Sellars, if there is a sense in which animality gives rise to reason, there's another in which reason gives rise to a new form of animality. The rationality of animality is a task, not a given. And ultimately, this is to say that rationality participates in creation. It is, in Platonic parlance, a craftsman or demiurge. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much, Ray. Okay, for this very rich and thought-provoking talk about animality, rationality, and the relations between them and the differences between them. I'm sure there are many questions about your talk. Does anyone want to ask a question? If anyone wants, please raise your hand, your Zoom hand, and we will now proceed to the questions for Ray's talk. Yes, Luz.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks. Hi, Dionysus. Hi, everyone.
Hi,
Good to be
Luz.
here.
Nice to see you.
Very nice to see you. So, Ray, I enjoyed the paper, reading it once more with you and having your voice over these words, and by the stress of your syllables here and understanding better where you want to go with this. And if I have questions, it's just a few questions that push forward on your reading of Sellers's metaphysics there. And I wanna ask you one question about this beautiful line: processes cannot derive from that which is not process. And
yes,
and the question is this, because you mentioned the ultimate fact, the actual history of the universe, and the empirical sciences providing us with the resources by which we can, I think you said, limit the ultimate resource of this fact. Meaning, so to everyone who's not familiar with this context of discussion, that's in science and metaphysics, and Sellars stipulating about the epistemology of the scientific community of Persians in the future, and to what extent the history of the universe is accessible to these Persian community. And there's a paragraph earlier in Science and Metaphysics in which Sellars wonders about the role of categories in this. And he says that it is the role of categories provided by the sciences, which, when schematized appropriately, help us move towards this, well, I guess the activity of limiting this. And I wanted you to tell us a little more about your views on the nature of categories, because it's, to my view, just too short in this paper what your views are on this. And I know you have more to say, so I wanted to invite you to tell us a little more about this, let's say, this limiting ideal, because it's a very contentious matter how to understand that limit. It seemingly is a very fierce commitment in Sellars, but it's also contested. So I want to hear your thoughts.
Okay, thanks. I mean, well, this is a very difficult question. And first, I think actually I said um, I said limb, not limit, and I think what I meant is that it's science that kind of provides us with the resources for stating this ultimate fact. Okay, but I understand your question because he also has this kind of claim about the ideal, this ideal science, the ultimate, the Pearson science, which would allow us, um,
From a
yes, I
raindrop
mean,
on
is
the
it possible?
Mhm.
Is it actually possible for any single, um, you know, theoretical discourse to, exhaustively, characterize this ultimate fact? Or is there such a thing as an ultimate fact? Okay. Um, that is kind of susceptible of being recognized in this way. Um, and I understand that's a very controversial claim. And I mean, I don't have anything. I mean, look, I think on the one hand, I mean, categories are, um, categories have a cognitive function. Okay, they allow us to kind of to realize our cognitive task, and that means that categories, you know um, as well as describing and explaining, they must all also be capable of like integrating and unifying knowledge. Okay, so that uh, we want to be able to kind of have a unified, or I take Sellars to be committed to the idea that our categorial system, that the um the discrepancy between the categories of the manifest and the scientific image is temporary and would have eventually be kind of supplanted by this synoptic vision, in which there'd be a kind of a perfect kind of kind of harmony, or a perfect integration of these two kind of heterogeneous categorical systems. And this also would have a practical, it means that we could understanding, knowing what something is, would allow us to kind of to appreciate its to understand what is its valence, its the good that it embodies for us. So in other words, no, I take Sellars to be saying that not knowing would not be disinterested or merely contemplative, but we could describe and explain the world in such a way that we would also be able to, to evaluate and to weigh the practical value, or the desirability of the things that we can understand. And that's the problem. And I think, like this, I am aware of the criticisms that have been made of this, um, scientific inquiry as a kind of as an ideal or as an infinite task. And in a way, because of the premium that Sellars allots to actuality. And I mean, look, I think that there's a strange kind of tension between Sellers's emphasis, very Aristotelian emphasis, on the primacy of effectivity, or of doing. When he says that to say that something is true is to say that there's something to be done, because
Mhm.
if something is true, then that means not only is something to be affirmed, but there's a practical intervention follows from that assertion. So this kind of implies a notion of actualization or effectivity of of energia, of Aristotelian energia, being as effectiveness, okay, as doing something. But this if there is this is difficult to square. If knowing does something, it's difficult to square with the idea that knowing, converges towards an ideal limit, because an ideal limit has no effectivity, or it has no actuality. It's precisely like just potentiality.
But isn't this the idea of the Platonic infusion of the soul with, let's say,
Yes,
a direction?
that
So this is how I understand the final bit where you say this is how we get from reasons into causes. But
yes,
let me squeeze you on something, if I may, Dionysus.
Yes,
yes,
Because
yes.
great. So it is in Science and Metaphysics 2, it's 49. It's this paragraph saying, "For as I see it, the use of analogy in theoretical science, unlike that in theology, generates no determinate concept. It does not merely indirectly specify certain unknown attributes by an analogy of proportion." And this is the sentence I want you to speak to. One might put this by saying that the conceptual structures of theoretical science give us new ways of schematizing categories. And I think for a long time, I thought that all he's doing is proposing that we accept the Kantian categories. But
Hmm.
the longer I work on Sellars on category, the more I think you have it right. Exactly, you have it exactly right. We articulate the categories from within our practice, and then we take science to help us specify and make them applicable in life. And in this sense, because of the dot quotability of categories, functional roles, and morals and modals, the schematization into real world contexts is a task where we may come to new ways of schematizing into new contexts, but this is compatible with also articulating new categories. And you could say the dogmatic or religious reading of Kant would say, no, the categories are outside of time. We just happen to have
Mm,
discovered them. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on this, because the so far all attempts to read his Persianism based on this religious reading of the categories have failed.
mm,
That doesn't go through. But then when you unless you have a reading of that last sentence that makes sense of categories as transformable while also acting as regulative ideals according to which we can schematize, unless you have that, you can't move forward in your interpretation of Sellars. And I think that's the aim here.
yes, I think I mean, this is very, very interesting. And I think, the reading you've just proposed is extremely, attractive to me. This idea that categories, so if science, if I understand that quotation from Science and Metaphysics, if scientific um, categories, their schematization allows us to kind of, to do something we weren't previously able to do, then there's a sense in which, categories um, are, they, um, categories are functional roles, and they operate within a kind of, a conceptual economy, a kind of a conceptual cognitive economy. And this role is dynamic, okay? It's not kind of, static. And that means that categories are both, they're malleable, but they change us, and they change what we can do, but we can also change them. So I mean, I take it that Sellers is suggesting there's a kind of dynamic interplay or feedback between the new things that categories allow us to think and do, and then what we do to those categories on the basis of the new things that they've allowed us to think and do. So that there's
Yeah,
this constant process, like where we see the world anew, we see the world differently, and this changes our practical orientation, and this therefore spurs us to also kind of, further hone or kind of transform these categories, to push these categories, um, or inflect them in a direction, which has been, precipitated, which they have also kind of, initiated. So I think that I think Sellars' emphasis on the word process. I mean, in a way, you could say that Sellars, he uses the word process in different registers, and the way in which he's using it in this early essay, like this essay on Aristotelian philosophies of mind, that's from I think the late 40s or early 50s. I think it's different from the way in which he'll use it in the later, when he's talking about, metaphysics of pure processes. But and I think I'm not sure if there's an equivocation in Sellars, because I think there's this idea of, ongoing tissues of goings on.
yeah,
It's easier to make sense of this dynamism, of this idea that, categories both, they transform our understanding, and in transforming our understanding, they enable, new capacities, new forms of intervention. That's a sense of, that's a kind of a more, in a way, manifest sense of process. It's not a kind of it's a different, it's a more familiar sense of process than this kind of processes as pure, processes as non-object bound, which is a more equally fascinating, but a more mysterious notion, which he comes up with. And then the question is whether you can kind of reconcile those two registers, of process in Sellars. But basically, I'm completely sympathetic to. I mean, the bottom line is I only have vague intuitions about how this all works. I definitely think that there's an incompatibility between the religious kind of, reading of, a completed ideal science.
yeah.
That interpretation seems to really be in conflict with everything else he's saying about the primacy of dynamism and process.
I agree. I guess one last thing, and this is to bring you, Dionysus, to ask you to speak to this. Ray, you say that Gluck's methodological premise must be wrong somehow, that indices of function cannot be rooted in resemblance.
Hmm.
And I take it that you're pointing towards the obviously true fact that, in a way, in Serlasian tongue, Bloch doesn't have uh, a second order isomorphism understanding that he would require, for instance, to
Yeah, I mean, to be very, I mean, I think it's a fascinating argument, but I think that the problem with the argument immediately manifests when, and he does say, um, that, the account works beautifully for cats, dogs, birds, squirrels, these kinds of creatures. Okay.
yeah,
It works beautifully. He says we can belief ascriptions are based on the subject manifesting certain perceptual capacities, attitudes, and emotions. In the long linguistic case, these include forms of behavior, postures, and facial expressions that higher animals share with human race. So it works fine with higher animals, but mammals, especially primates and mammals. Okay. But then as soon as you look at anything that isn't a mammal, or anything whose physiology is radically different from, mammalian physiology, then, behavior, postures, and facial expressions, it seems it's very difficult to, to infer capacities, attitudes, and emotions from behaviors, postures, and expressions. Like with cephalopods, reptiles, these other creatures, creatures that don't have, familiar faces. And that's where I think the Sellarsian kind of, so I think that's where I think that, anthropocentric, a kind of anthropomorphism is inescapable. And that's what I meant how by transplanting kind of, in a way, you know, by transplanting propositional structure from thought to the world through facts, by simply kind of have an ontology of facts which are structured, but without having an account for, differences in structure at different levels of facts, the macro level and the micro level,
Yeah,
then you end up with this kind of either you say, every creature inhabits a different world, okay? And in which case, then even, talking about, what dogs and cats believes becomes analogical once again. Um, or you say that actually there is a kind of, a pre-established, there's a single factual structure of the world, which is somehow kind of perceived by all these animals, but there's no account of, how creatures with radically different perceptual capacities can perceive the same facts.
yeah. I
Um,
mean, and this is the point where I wanted to ask you, Dionysus, what do you think? Ray, you say that Aristotelian systems deduce representations from one another on the basis of standing compound representation, and then you give logical constants. And you write these codified relations among representations which are not contained in the representations themselves. Sellars says there is no notness in the world or something, right?
mm,
And I think this is all classical Sellars, but then contemporary advances in logical expressivism, they suggest that it's not just about codifying relations among representations, but in a, you could say, process metaphysical sense, codifying relations among relations
hmm
of ever more complex orders of resemblance classes, because Deleuze bases all his functional role semantics and dot quotation on similar enough, which is why indices of functions cannot be rooted in resemblance jumped out at me, because in a way he gets his functional role semantics off the ground only by relying, by being able to rely on relevantly similar functions. But
hmm
that clearly is a resemblance among functional roles or relation, like types of relations, and that's a meta. Um, you could say cognitive process, which I think invites process ontology.
I see. Okay. No, that's I see. That's no, no. That's actually that's extremely helpful. I hadn't considered that, but that's actually very, very helpful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe Dionysus, I said you're the
No,
host, right? And so officially you're not allowed to occupy space in the room for so long. But then again, you're the one who's written most on this, and so
no,
if you
no.
feel,
I find it very interesting and fascinating, your proposal. And now maybe I'm not sure if it's right to intervene right now or after but let me say this. I find very interesting your quote with the this Larsian 1949 paper, about the ultimate structure, the ultimate fact. The history of the world is the ultimate fact, and the ultimate fact is um, the fact that the actual processes that took place in the world are at bottom what ultimately explains what we say, what we call substantial form, kinds, properties. Or I found that very, very interesting. It's a use of process there in the 1949 paper, Sellars paper, that maybe hints towards a process ontology that would ground, let's say, our substance and property talk without reifying them as a separate ontology. And all this, you said that you hinted about, I mean, your argument against Glock indirectly hints in this direction because what's the problem with Glock that, from what I understood, that all these uh, animal worlds with their, I mean, different umwelts would be at bottom, if we are Aristotelians, they're just given there, and you can't explain how they uh, can possibly merge as parts of one and the same world. Let's say this, and you couldn't possibly explain this if you don't appeal to facts that do not presuppose the categories in which we and through which we understand the animal worlds. And this could be another argument in favor of changing our categorical basis to understand how it is even possible for animal worlds to emerge for different, very different and even incommensurable regarding their perceptual abilities. Worlds, animal worlds, how it is possible for them to even emerge and be part of a single reality. And here, maybe you didn't say it or you don't accept it, but maybe the ultimate history of the universe again is somewhere in the vicinity of explaining, I mean, in scare quotes, explaining this possibility of emergence of animal worlds. I don't know. So that's what I wanted to say. Sorry about it. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I mean, I think Sellars, I think, is trying to, instead of opposing, representations and capacities, he wants to say that, representation is itself a capacity. And it's a special kind of capacity. It's the capacity which explains the emergence of mindedness. When he says, the mental event is the most fundamental um, uh, the concept of a mental event is the most, I think, what does he say? Fundamental. Sorry, I'm going back. Yeah. The core concept of a mental event is that of a representational event. Okay. So a mental event, so I take him to mean that, any talk of like, thinking or intending, any account of kind of, even kind of, sentience, is, is going to be representational. So I think the representation and representational systems are there to explain the emergence of worlds. Okay, because if to be minded is to inhabit a world, or if to be an animal is to inhabit a world, a life world, and it's the animal's relation to its, umwelt, kind of environments that kind of, that unifies it, they're reciprocally unifying, then it's precisely representation that explains, the genesis of the of organic unity and the unity as correlated with the unity of a world in you know in which animals develop specific capacities. Okay, and I think so. I agree with what Danas has just said, that without if you simply kind of oppose capacities to representation, or if you try to replace what the representationalist account must do according to Sellars with a capacities account, then you have animals inhabiting, either all inhabiting kind of, different worlds, and then the unity, the coherence amongst these worlds becomes kind of difficult to grasp, or they inhabit the same world, but you can't explain in virtue of what You can't explain how they're all capable of grasping the same facts differently through different capacities. And I think that Sellars is, the strength of Sellars' account is to understand that capacities, an Aristotelian emphasis on capacity as the primacy of capacity as as purposeful activity, in which an organism is striving to realize kind of certain purposes in its world. It needs to be supplemented by an account of representation. Otherwise, it generates otherwise it becomes mystificatory, I think. So I think he's trying to reconcile, in a way, Kant and Aristotle. I see him as using Kant to kind of to supplement Aristotle, so that you can locate Aristotelian insights at a different level, but they have to be kind of they apply, as he puts it, within the manifest image, but they cannot be used to to curb the scope of the scientific image, or of scientific description and explanation, as trying to explain the genesis of worlds, the genesis of the genesis of unified life worlds, and of purposeful activity within those worlds.
Okay. So we have another question by Alexander Niehoff.
Yeah, thank you. First, thank you for the interesting paper. I had first two things, and now a third point to ask or to say. In the first place, you already talked a bit about this relationship between Kant and Aristotle here, because I think to some degree Sellars is trying to do out of Aristotle something that is actually in Kant's third critique. In Kant's third critique on the teleological reason, you can see the attempt of a construction to actually explain how it is possible to conceive something as an animal or something that is made out of a concept without actually asserting that this concept is a cause for it, or it does not necessarily be a cause for it. And here Sellars is trying to say that for Aristotle, this is just analogous to a craftsmanship, and on the other side, Plato is like being put as like the metaphysician here, who actually states that the concept is like the reason for the movement. But in fact, I would say that Aristotle himself has in fact an idea of an proper cause of the animal life, and he has in fact a metaphysical point of view in which the concepts are like responsible as causes for everything that happens on the world. So I would say that this contrast that is drawn here by Sellars doesn't work so good, and he would possibly go better if he would actually just apply to Kant himself. I would say. Yeah, and the second point, you had this small discussion here about the possibility of changing categories, like the possibility of having a different framework for science. And I was working some time on Sellars and also on Badiou, and I think that to some degree that the actual category theory of the mathematicians has some potential to explain like a more general way of transcendental philosophy, how it is, for example, explained in the logic of worlds, and it could be used to describe like the possibility of different categorical frameworks, like not just Euclidean spaces, but also topological spaces as a framework for science. And there you could possibly find at last a hint how to construct a dynamic theory of categories. And yes, and I guess the third point I had is not that important, but I guess there's a small book of Aristotle on the movement of animals, in which he also explains the movement of animals with syllogisms. So with actual syllogisms, And I'm not. It's long ago I read that book, but this could be interesting for contrasting this Humean account of associative inferences and this Aristotelian account. Yeah, this were my points. But yeah, thank you for the interesting paper.
Thank you. Okay, thanks for those comments. They're very very helpful. About the Aristotle Kant Sellars' relation to Aristotle and Kant. Yes, that's I'm very well, to my knowledge, I'm very curious about what Sellars yes, about the extent to which Sellars draws on the third critique and relationship between his account and Kant's account in the third critique. It's obviously a connection, and I need to investigate further. That's something I'm very interested in. I take so you're saying that you think Sellars' account works better with Kant than it does the Kant of the third critique than it does with Aristotle. And in a way, this connects to your third kind of remark about Aristotle's account of reasons as explaining, animal motion. I mean, yeah, this is a. I mean, I guess. Yeah, this is a very, I think, interesting, but also kind of, perplexing issue for me is, in a way, because I mean, I guess the key difference would be that Sellars, is a kind of, a post-Darwinian philosopher. So, although he thinks that, he's also interested in a way in kind of, salvage or rendering the kind of the purposefulness or kind of teleology kind of compatible with a kind of a broadly Darwinian framework. So and I guess the point about that, Patrick, he wants to explain how purposes emerge, sort of purposes or how purposes evolve from kind of initially purposeless or kind of from kind of arbitrary concatenations of of mechanism or efficient causation. So I think the key difference would be that Sellars takes the philosophical task to be not simply to kind of eliminate all appeals to teleology or to organic purposiveness, but to find a way of explaining the genesis of purposefulness, and in a way that organisms themselves begin once organisms emerge and evolve, then they begin to transform, they act on the world and they begin to shape the world differently, to transform the nexus of causation within which they are imbricated. So I think, yeah, I mean, I don't, that's just a kind of a half-baked kind of thought. And the point about category theory, yeah, this is incredibly fascinating. I mean, I would like to kind of seriously get to grips with category theory. I know the account of it that Badiou gives in Logics of Worlds, and it's fascinating. It's a bit at the limit of my understanding. My mathematical understanding is very limited, but I know philosophers who who work with who are studying kind of category theory and who have stressed to me its extraordinary kind of significance, precisely in terms of, as you said, proposing a dynamic theory of categories. So no, that's very helpful, and that is just something else I need to investigate.
Okay, thanks.
Dionysus, you're muted, I think.
Tom, can you?
Okay, do you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Great. Thank you very much, Ray, for this wonderful talk. My point would be very, simple, and it is more methodological. I wanted to understand exactly. You said that the problem with clock is that there are levels or between a cockroach and, for example, a mammal, and how it represents reality. And we don't just talking about facts, and the cockroach um, represents reality as a fact, and the mammal represents reality as a fact, and the human represents reality as a fact. Is not that doesn't have the grades or the complexity that we need for understanding their behavior. But my problem with this, if I follow you correctly, is that again to do these equivalencies between our representation, our propositional form, and the mammal's propositional form, and the cockroach's propositional form. Again, to do those equivalencies, we need to go back to their behavior and their dispositions. And again, the problem will appear that in a cockroach, it's way more difficult to draw this equivalence between our propositional for what we represent and what exactly the cockroach represents. So what I'm trying to say is why representational form or propositional form help us understand better cockroaches representational system or behavior than postures, emotions, behavior, because again, for drawing those equivalencies between the sortals, what exactly is the meaning of the propositional form? Again, we will have to go back again to dispositions or the behavior. I'm not sure if it was clear or something.
No, that's a very good question. It's a difficult question. Let me see. Okay, what's propositional form for Sellars is referring and characterizing. So I think the example of the cockroach is helpful here. So obviously there's a huge difference between, how, let's say, how a dog refers, and characterizes, a bone, to a bone, and how the cockroach refers and characterizes to, let's say the piece of sugar, it wants to kind of, to get or to eat. Now, so I take Sellars to be saying that, look, all that is required for propositional form, or a mental event generates propositional form by referring and characterizing, okay? But this referring and characterizing need not involve, language as we know it. It just, representation just is kind of minimally referring and characterizing. And it can work through, this kind of, how this is done, how the referring and characterizing is done. Well, obviously, if you study kind of neuroanatomy, you can, the nervous systems of organisms can do this in all sorts of different ways. Okay, so we can think that a cockroach can refer and characterize to pieces of sugar on the floor, but obviously it's not referring or characterizing to them as sugar. So what is what it's responding to, or like kind of chemicals, etc., other stuff like this. There is a functional analogy, like even with a cockroach, we can describe a cockroach as eating or as fleeing, or as, I mean, we have a very impoverished vocabulary because the analogy is stretched, but we can say a few basic things. Oh, it's trying to escape, someone's stepping on it, it's trying to get a piece of food, it's flying, okay? We can still establish these kind of basic, behavioral equivalences, except with they're very coarse grained. The behavioral equivalences that we establish between, ourselves and cockroaches are much more impoverished compared to those we establish between ourselves and dogs or cats. And so I think it's important to say that, the representation is not linguistic, like, complicated intelligent behavior does not require kind of linguistic representation. And logical form only kicks in when you have something like relations amongst representations that can, and the representation of relations amongst representations. And that's where, the in a way the resources for analogy are most adequate, okay, because we're closer to home, so to speak. I think look, I think the point that Sellars is making is that, we can, at the level of behavior, I guess he's saying that the point would be, that we find a way of, establishing analogies at the level of behavior so that we can recognize things like feeding, or fleeing, or hiding or whatever. But we don't do it using any kind of straightforward, in a way that's, I take it this is how zoologists work, is that they don't, the ways in which kind of animals with very different kind of morphologies, do the same thing is very different based on, the bodies they have, their environment, what kind of food they eat, etc., etc. So the claim would be that, the point is, I guess, is to kind of defend the usefulness or the indispensability of analogy, but analogy without resemblance, an analogy without obvious or first order perceptual resemblance. And I think, and that's where there's a kind of, conceptual elaboration involved, because I take Sellars' point to be that the more, in a way, once the more sophisticated your representational system is, the more capable you are of establishing analogies independently of, perceptual resemblances. And so I guess, what am I trying to say is that it's not clear that you can do, well, in a way, I think Sellars is going to say that this is what, these capacities, once you can establish a kind of, a functional analogy, then you can establish an analogy at the level of capacity, because what is being done is the same. The way in which, a spider ingests and digests is very different from the way in which a dog ingests and digests, but we can reliably say they're ingesting and digesting. And I think he's saying that you have to go from function to capacity, and you can't hope to identify capacities yes, is that what a capacity is, what what a creature is doing is never self-evident, okay? So that we think it seems to be self-evident for us, in the famous kind of example that Glock discusses from Norman Malcolm, like the dog chasing the cat up a tree. The dog is looking up at the tree. The dog believes that the cat is in the tree. So that seems obvious that the dog believes that the cat is hiding in the tree. But it becomes much more difficult to specify and to kind of to determine capacities with further afield, basically, and with unfamiliar creatures. I guess I don't know if that responds. I don't know if that's addressing the question you asked.
That's perfect. That's perfect. I think it cleared a lot of the ground that I want to say.
Okay.
Yeah, because my question was why not first have capacities and then representations. So, for example, saying at first that a cockroach is a living being and so needs to eat, do other vital activities, and then talking about their representational mapping of the of reality. But you cleared about this point.
Okay. Good.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have another question from Alexander.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to say that I'm already working on a theory how to extend the idea of Badiou, finding in category theory actually a possibility of a generalized transcendental philosophy. And it's still a long road to go, but I guess the potential is infinite. You can translate so much things of Kant's critique and maybe also of more ideas of Sellars into category theory and, for example, understand the relationship between a proposition or a geometric shape to language and stuff like this. With the help of category theory, the possibilities are impressive. I'm here in Paris, and I was here for 1 year or something. Also a regular visitor of the Mamoufi seminars of François Nicolas, which you probably know. So I'm also in contact with mathematicians and people who know of this stuff. So yeah, maybe if you're curious or something, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. No, that sounds fascinating. No, I'd be very interested in hearing more. Basically, no, definitely. Thanks.
Okay.
Oh, okay. We have another question from David Cortez.
Yeah. Hi, Raymond.
Hi, David. Hi.
Thank you very much for the talking. It was very interesting and illuminating. I just have a question that is not it's not addressed in the paper. It's I would say just suggest, and you talk about in some other papers and works, and it's the articulation of causes and reasons. Well, because you actually said that Sellars epistemic demarcation suggests a conversion, a metaphysical conversion from causes into reasons. And when you end up the paper with this integration from Aristotle and Plato, that's precisely the point. The substantiality as artificiality. Rationality as being itself the way of giving shaping the world. So I think that's your way of saying that that's the account, the Sellars account for articulation of reasons and causes. But I remember in another paper of you, which is the dialectics of suspicion and trust, when you actually make the same question, how can we think about reasons and causes, but without falling into the risk of metaphysical conflation that's happened, for instance, in post-structuralism, but also avoiding what in post-Sellarsian philosophy happens a lot, which is like a sort of normativism in the sense that rationality becomes dehistorized. I mean, it's not anchored in the way the animal form of life of human. It's embodied and also shaped by social form and etc. So my question will be: this the Sellarian account can address that question of not falling prey into this danger of not taking into account the subjective form that mediates the way in which we relate with each other, the embodiment of human mind. Yeah, that's basically my question, because you mentioned, but I don't know if it's like you're something still working it, but you constantly touch this problem. But I don't know if Sellars maybe can provide us with keys or insights of how to solve it, or maybe there's like a tension in Sellars' work as well. That's basically what I wanted to ask.
Okay, thanks. Actually, yeah, the first thing you said at the end of and the final quote, quotation from Sellars, um, no, or a claim I attribute to him is that substantiality, substantial form, or kind of or what is commonly called organic unity, is artifactual. Okay, so the point I take Sellers's point that that substantial form, that the substantial form that we recognize in the world is just a kind of yes, we have these, we recognize these types of things as organisms, and we recognize these things as communities of organisms. But I think one of the things he's hinting at is that the evolution and the refinement of our categorial apparatus, and in a way of our conceptual discriminatory prowess, will allow us to recognize, more and more kinds of forms of substantiality. Will allow us to kind of, to recognize synthetic or non-organic kind of modes of substantial form, or of unity, and realize that kind of these are unities, processual unities, things, emerging kind of unities or processes of kind of, unification. And in a way that this is recognizing the ability, to perceive, and to acknowledge in a way not non-empirically evident or not immediately perceptually evident forms of wholeness or of unity, is something that is a task is a responsibility of reason. Okay, that's what reason is compelled to recognize. So this is a kind of so kind of unities without, or forms of unity that are not grounded in empirical resemblance. Okay, and in recognizing, a unity, we also recognize that we have, we're compelled to kind of to relate, to respond to it appropriately and to treat it appropriately. I think this is tied to his account of like, person, personhood. A person is a kind of a locus of kind of agency, but persons need not look like us, need not even look like kind of, organisms as we recognize them habitually. And that's the sense in which reasons can be, this is the rearticulation of reasons and causes in which, rationality emerges from, from a series of like, processes which are not kind of, inherently rational, so like it emerges accidentally or contingently. But once it's emerged, it becomes capable, and then also kind of compelled to pursue and to strive towards these kind of artifactual unities. This, as he puts it, this system of, incorporeal forms, because incorporeal forms are, unities that are not kind of empirically evident. And they're things that only reason can recognize. And in recognizing them, reason is compelled to do something, and to kind of to intervene and to kind of, to change, the organization of the world. So that's the sense in which I think, and this ties into the, this issue of like subjective mediation. So there's a sense in which once, I mean, look, I take, it's not enough, most philosophical naturalism is kind of, most contemporary philosophical naturalism is broadly Darwinian in that it realizes that humans are evolved animals and that, our cognitive capacities are also kind of, evolved. They're not, they've evolved over millennia. They're not kind of God-given. I think Marx adds a kind of a layer, kind of supplements this account by pointing out, how, the institutions, the social forms, the way in which we organize ourselves socially and historically is also has evolved, has changed. It's not compelled by mechanical teleology, but it's compelled by accidents and kind of, contingencies. But once we recognize a certain kind of, we can begin to recognize a certain kind of, an emerging kind of pattern or trajectory, and it's, incumbent upon us to kind of to organize. There are better ways of organizing ourselves socially and collectively, which facilitate and amplify the effectiveness of reason, our ability to kind of to realize our purposes, okay, to realize our goals, okay, to satisfy our desires. So I think that Sellers's point, it's not. I think it's a mistake, both in a way. I think he's suggesting that it's like substantial form or unity. It's neither kind of it's not eternally pre-established. You can't read off the order of substantial forms from your manifest kind of understanding of the world. But you can begin, but it has it's of decisive importance, and it's of decisive importance to be capable of realizing greater unity than currently obtains in the world. And that, both kind of cognitive unity, but also kind of, social, social unity. And, that this would be, this is tied to a kind of, a program of practical reason in which we know we have to kind of, in understanding, the artifactuality of our own kind of categorial system and of the social relations in which those categorial systems operate, then we can strive to kind of to transform both, to use one to transform the other, use or improved understanding to transform our relations to one another, and also use these improved relations to improve our understanding. I think that's the kind of I'm extrapolating a lot, but I think that this is, I think the stuff about we intentions in Sellars is about this. And I think it is related to Sellars, to Hegel's I that is we and we that is I. In other words, to kind of, to truly, to be rational is, to recognize yourself in others, but in others that, don't look like you, and may not kind of, not only kind of, morphologically, but behaviorally, linguistically, etc. So that's the sense in which reasons can become causes. But I think the claim would be that in that kind of, in that paper I gave about genealogy, which is just a kind of a gloss on Brandon's kind of critique of the hermeneutics of suspicion. The point is that you do need the hermeneutics of suspicion to be able to kind of identify and in a way reject mystificatory the mystificatory fusions of reasons and causes, or a kind of theological or mystificatory kind of conflation of reasons and causes. So it's important to be able to kind of to disintricate them, but then you can't just leave them. If you simply kind of separate them, you're left with a dualism of reasons and causes. So you have to find a way to kind of to reconnect them. And I take it that it's that kind of second step that Sellars is interested in, as is Brandom in a way, but in a differently. Okay, I don't know if that addressed your question.
Yeah. I actually, just the final two things you said, I think answer my question. Like you said, that understanding the artifactuality of our own categorical framework in order to transform our relation to ourselves and to one another. It's like saying that we are able like to understand, to comprehend, let's say, the intellectual conditions that structure our practice. It's also pointing to transform them materially, or at least that's how I understand the last thing you said.
Yes, because these practices, because reasoning is anchored in kind of discursive practices, which are also social practices. So it never kind of although you can't collapse reasons into causes, you can't, you have to understand they feed into one another. And I guess you can't simply kind of neatly segregate them. Like you can't be satisfied with their segregation once you've distinguished them.
Thank you very much, Ray.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Sorry. I was speaking all this time. I just wanted to say to you that we're 10 minutes after 7 and we must end the conversation unless there is one more quick question if one wants to ask a quick question. Sorry about that. I forgot. Let's see. Okay. So because the link we have from the Academy of Athens will expire after a while, I would like for this conversation to last forever, I guess. So let me thank Ray Brassier again for being here with us today. And it was very interesting and, of course, thought-provoking talk, and all the questions were extremely interesting. I will upload the discussion after a few days, so for those who didn't have the opportunity to see it, it will be online after a few days. So again, thank you very much, Ray, and the seminar will be here again next month with Luz. Luz, will you come here? Okay. We will have Luz Sabers next month. I think it will be 22 of June 22. Yes. Again, thank you very much, Ray, for this wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thanks again for inviting me.
And I hope
thanks.
we meet in person eventually, not only in Zoom meeting.
Yes, no, it'd be nice. Hopefully, sometime
Hopefully,
soon.
yes. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks
Okay,
everyone for attending this.
bye.
Bye.